discussion opportunity. And I'm thrilled to welcome from America, Robert Hass and Virginia Smith from the Robert Frost Society. Robert is the director, I believe, of the Robert Frost Society. He's a poet, critic and scholar who's, amongst other awards, won an Academy of American Poets Prize. And he teaches American literature, classical literature and Shakespeare at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. So, welcome, Robert. And Virginia is a professor of chemistry at the United States Naval Academy, where she maintains an active research program. Currently on a sabbatical, is it?
No.
No such luck. And Virginia is also editor of the Robert Frost Review. And joining from the UK, we have Edna Longley, who is Emerita Professor of English from Queen's University, Belfast, and an eminent Edward Thomas specialist, and has written, or edited, amongst other, the annotated collected poems of Edward Thomas, which I have to say is my Bible. I carry it around with me as much as I can. We're joined with Guy Cuthbertson, who is professor at Liverpool Hope University, and again has published and contributed to Cambridge University, volumes relating to Oxford. Sorry, we heard about Cambridge earlier, and it stuck before it drowns. So Oxford, and Tom Durham, who is an actor and another Thomas specialist. Everybody here loves the work of Edward Thomas. And I'm going to pass over to Edna, who's going to give a brief further introduction to the evening.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hello across the pond. This is our third transatlantic dialogue about the literary and sometimes personal relationship between Edward Thomas and Robert Frost. If we were to talk about that subject for many years, I think it would remain inexhaustible. It's generally a bad thing to confine poets to national boxes. And I feel that in this case, that habit has obscured a relationship, an artistic conversation, which has been crucial to modern poetry in the English language. Separately, Frost and Thomas are strong presences. The power of their joint presence and its influence on later poets, I think, should be more widely recognized. End of speech, really. As in previous years, the format for this session will be a mix of readings and discussion. The readings will set poems and sometimes prose passages by Frost and Thomas alongside each other, so that similarities and differences may emerge. And in planning the programme for this evening, we've kept in mind the theme, the motif for this year's Edward Thomas Literary Festival, the Woodland Life, a theme taken from the title of Thomas's first book, published in 1897. And that theme obviously places in the foreground both poets concerned with nature, the countryside, with what Frost calls country things, and especially with the trees, woods and forests in which pervade their poems. There are so many trees, woods and forests in both Thomas and Frost. And the Woodland Life, that title, might also imply ways in which their poetry anticipated environmental questions. So there'll be three groups of readings, followed by discussion. Frost's poetry will be read by our American friends, with one or two exceptions. Thomas's words will be voiced by Tom Durham. And the first group of readings, of which more in a moment, will focus on the fact that the Woodland Life A collection of essays on the natural world was Thomas's first book. The second group of readings will involve poems that mark some ways in which Thomas and Frost represent or respond to the actual countryside, its flora, fauna, and people. And we might ask whether there are significant Anglo-American differences, not only between their poetic landscapes, but also in their approach to what might be called pastoral poetry. The third group of readings will suggest the symbolic role of all those trees, woods, and forests. But I should add that poems, as poems do, will undoubtedly escape categories to which we have assigned them. I said we'd start by keeping in view the fact that The Woodland Life was Thomas's first book, published 17 years before he switched from prose to poetry in December 1914. And so what were the circumstances and influences behind him and Frost becoming writers? Frost started writing poems as a schoolboy, but his first collection, A Boy's Will, wasn't published until 1913, and he had to come to England to get it published. So our first group of readings will involve several extracts from The Woodland Life, and these extracts will also suggest how some passages prefigure poems by Thomas. And the readings will begin appropriately with Thomas's essay, memoir, How I Began.
How I Began, from The Last Sheep. I do not remember hearing it said that I could or should write as I thought or as I spoke. Until the age of 8 or 9, therefore, all my writing was painful and compulsory, and I knew well it displayed a poorer creature than the severest critic could judge me. But at that age, I was given a small notebook. In a cover as much like tortoiseshell as could be made for a penny. In this, I wrote down a number of observations of my own accord. All that I can remember is that I pronounced the houses of Swindon to be like bulldogs, small but strongly built. They were of stone, and I was accustomed to brick. Stone seemed to be a grander material, hence the note. The sententious form was, no doubt, due to a conscious desire to be impressive, that is to say, adult. It was not the last time I experienced this desire, but I shall not trouble you with more instances. With short intervals from that time onwards, I was a writer by choice. I began several diaries, carrying on the entries in some of them as far as February. By the time I was 14 or 15, I did more. I kept a more or less daily record of notable events, the finding of birds' nests, the catching of moles or fish, the skinning of a stoat, the reading of Richard Jefferies and the naturalists. These notes aimed at brevity. They were above syntax and indifferent to dignity. I was not, however, permitted to forget syntax or dignity. I was obliged to write essays on imperial federation, the Greek colonization of Sicily, holidays, etc., where I gave myself up to an almost purely artistic rendering of such facts as I remembered and such opinions as I could concoct by the help of memory, fancy, and the radical and free-thinking atmosphere of home. Thus, like nearly every other child, I virtually neglected in my writing the feelings that belong to my own nature and my own times of life, an irreparable loss, whether great or not. If I wrote about what really pleased or concerned me, like a walk all day or all night in Wiltshire, I had in view not the truth, but the eyes of elders. I was considered to excel in this form of rhetoric. So seriously, too, did I take myself in it, that from the time I was 16, I found myself hardly letting a week pass without writing one or two descriptions of a man or a place or a walk in a manner largely founded on Jeffrey's Amateur Poacher, Kingsley's Prose Idylls, and Mr. Francis A. Knight's weekly contributions to the Daily News, but doubtless with tones supplied also by Shelley and Keats, and later on by Ruskin, De Quincey, Pater, and Sir Thomas Browne. I had quite a number of temptations to print, and at the age of 15, easily gave way. At 17, some of these descriptions were printed in the Speaker and the New Age, and soon afterwards took the form of a book, The Woodland Life.
Thank you, Tom. I believe I'm supposed to follow up with a couple of Frost's early ruminations on his beginnings. And I've selected a couple of passages, one from a letter to Susan Hayes Ward on April 22nd, 1894, and a second one, which was a letter to William Stanley Braithwaite in 1915, March of 1915, wherein he accompanied the letter with a copy of A Boy's Will. So I'll read these two passages now. When I am well, I read a great deal, and like a nearsighted person, follow the text closely. I read novels in the hope of strengthening my executive faculties. Thomas Hardy has taught me the good use of a few words, and referring still to me, struck the simple solemn. And as opposed to this man, Scott and Stevenson inspire me by their prose, with the thought that we Scotchmen are bound to be romanticists, poets. Then as for poems, my favorites are and have been these: Keats' Hyperion, Shelley's Prometheus, Tennyson's Morte d'Arthur, and Browning's Saul, all of them about the giants. Besides these, I am fond of the whole collection of Palgrave's. So far, everything looks auspicious, but it is necessary to admit that I teach orthography in a district school, and that in the fitness of things, the association of Eugene Aram with children in this capacity seems no more incongruous than my own. The second passage I'd like to read is from the letter to Braithwaite. I kept farm, so to speak, for nearly 10 years, but less as a farmer than as a fugitive from the world that seemed to me to disallow me. It was all instinctive, but I can see now that I went away to save myself and fix myself before I measured my strength against all creation.
Thank you.
Now, a reading from The Woodland Life, and we must imagine the schoolboy, 17-year-old Edward. Presently, the rooks leave the meadow and the peewits are alone, but they cannot remain long still, and soon they start quarreling among themselves. It is a beautiful sight to watch their facile turns of flight as each strives to surmount his rival. Now a couple seem as one bird, and again they part to soar and twist in opposite directions. As they race, the sun gleams on their crests and greenish bars, and the peewit swings in the air with the prowess of flight. In a straight, steady motion, rarely do the peewit, their wings are soundless. But in the whirling dashes from side to side in combat or amorous display, a strange wind-like rush is made, as if their joints were stiff. Under the strong sun, when it is too dazzling to look up, this rushing sound betrays the bird as it passes overhead. Though less loud and decided, it strongly resembles the bleating of snipe and can be heard at some height, though the turns which cause it are usually made near the ground. 20 years later, Edward has not yet enlisted, but the First World War has begun. Two peewits. Under the after sunset sky, two peewits sport and cry, more white than is the moon on high, riding the dark surge silently, more black than earth. Their cry is the one sound under the sky. They alone move, now low, now high, and merrily they cry to the mischievous spring sky, plunging earthward, soaring high, over the ghost who wonders why. So merrily they cry and fly, nor choose twixt earth and sky. While the moon's quarter silently rides, and earth rests as silently.
Okay, so I think I am next. So this was the first time in preparation for this session, it was the first time I had read The Woodland Life. I already knew his prose and I knew it was beautiful. And this quite took me off guard because there's really no plot or anything, but these descriptive passages. And so I'm going to read a descriptive passage from the chapter called Lydiard Tregoze, which is a village, the name of a village near Swindon. So the gay daffodils dance where all may see. Soon their yellow cups are beaten down to earth by rain, and the dewy nectar pours from them. But by slow degrees, the sunlight lifts them again, and at midday, after a kindly touch, they are as erect as ever. And when I read that, it reminded me, of course, of a short poem by Frost from West Running Brook. And it was also a scene that I, and perhaps you, have seen in your flower beds of these flowers being tipped over. But the poem by Frost is called Lodged. The rain to the wind said, "You push and I'll pelt." They so smote the garden bed that the flowers actually knelt and lay lodged, though not dead. I know how the flowers felt.
I just want to apologize a little bit for my friend Don Sheehy, who had a dental emergency. So I was joking prior to everyone coming in that my friend Don had been lodged. So I'm going to be reading his passages today. I'm going to read a small poem from A Boy's Will called October. I ordered up this beautiful October day just for this occasion. It's 46 degrees, the gray clouds are scudding, the turkey vultures are soaring above me. And it just seems absolutely perfect for this very good poem in A Boy's Will. I think one of the best poems in A Boy's Will. October. Oh, hushed October morning mild, thy leaves have ripened to the fall. Tomorrow's wind, if it be wild, should waste them all. The crows above the forest call. Tomorrow they may form and go. Oh, hushed October morning mild, begin the hours of this day slow. Make the day seem to us less brief. Hearts not averse to being beguiled, beguile us in the way you know. Release one leaf at break of day. At noon, release another leaf. One from our trees, one far away. Retard the sun with gentle mist. Enchant the land with amethyst. Slow, slow, for the grapes' sake, if they were all, whose leaves already are burnt with frost, whose clustered fruit must else be lost, for the grapes' sake, along the wall.
And now back to the 17-year-old Edward in The Woodland Life from In Autumn Woods. The leaves are falling from the poplars steadily, one by one, and occasionally in little showers. The frosty night has done its work, and what were Erstwhile glowing green leaves are now fast spreading the sward with a somberly yet sumptuously coloured carpet. There is no wind, and the pearly haze hangs oppressively over the treetops, thereby obscuring the true outline of the branches. It is this dead stillness and gloom that make the fall of the leaves so arresting. No flutter of wind drifts through them through the air. No subtle rays of sunlight play upon their glossy surfaces to make ephemeral fairy glintings as they wave. Not even the robin sings to them as they glide through the stirless space from branch to earth. Their disappearance from the picture is marked by nothing but the solemn rustle as each leaf touches and settles upon the growing heap. In the coppice, at a short distance from the poplar grove, there is a scene of surpassing beauty. The narrow, winding path is completely hidden by dead leaves, their colours mingling in charming confusion. Sycamores are heaped on sycamores and broad horse chestnuts over all, while ever and anon, feathery ash leaves drift lazily down. The tints of this medley of leaves bewilder description. Red and gold and orange are thrown together fairily, while some of the horse chestnuts still retain a few streaks of green. Even as we gaze on this wondrous scene of colour, the mist disperses and the sunbeams pour down further to enliven what was already gay. As far as I can see, through the maze of trunks, the earth is strewn with gorgeous hues lit up anew. As the light varies, the shadows shift, and now the orange, now the gold is all aflame. 20 years later, he has enlisted and he is now training at the Hare Hall camp in Essex at High Beach, which is famous, of course, in literature as being the asylum where John Clare and Tennyson's brother were treated. And of course, the papers are now full of casualty lists. October. The green elm, with the one great bough of gold, lets leaves into the grass slip one by one. The short hill grass, the mushrooms, small, milk white, harebell and scabious and tormentil, the blackberry and gorse in dew and sun bow down to, and the wind travels too light to shake the fallen birch leaves from the fern. The gossamers travel at their own will. At heavier steps than birds, the squirrels scold. The late year has grown fresh again and new as spring, and to the touch is not more cool than it is warm to the gaze. Now I might, as happy be, as earth is beautiful, were I some other, or with earth could turn, in alternation of violet and rose, harebell and snowdrop at their season due, and gorse that has no time not to be gay. But if this be not happiness, who knows? Someday I shall think this a happy day, and this mood, by the name of melancholy, shall no more blackened and obscured be.
Well, those were the first set of readings, and it really is extraordinary how, and there are other passages too, how images, impressions in the Woodland Life percolate through to poems written 20 years later. Extraordinary consistency from first to last, despite all the changes in Thomas's literary life. I'd actually like to ask you if just the poems in A Boy's Will, how poems that survive, are there any from his extreme usefulness as a poet, or did he keep changing the poems he wanted to keep over the years, or what is that history, or can you see a development similar to Thomas's going on?
Well, he did revise a couple of poems, early poems. For example, The Quest of the Purple Fringe, which we're going to be reading later, was an early poem that he first called The Quest of the Orchis. He has a very early version of The Black Cottage, which he wrote fairly early, which completely became something different when he later published it. So he was always wrestling and working with different drafts of different poems. But I think for the most part, when Frost set something down and decided to publish it, it was very rare that he would change anything at all. In terms of publication history, we see slight variants here and there, but nothing major. One of the things that strikes me about Thomas's How I Began is that confession that some of his early work feels inauthentic, that he wasn't being true to his own nature. And I think in the Woodland Life and in A Boy's Will, we see some of that kind of high Victorian language permeating both the poems and the prose in a way that both of these figures would later grow out of. And if I can suggest that maybe it's Thomas's reading of Jeffries and Kingsley and some of the other nature writers who kind of hardened his sensibility, who brought him into the modern world in later books and especially in his poems. And we see that same kind of growth in Frost's poems as well.
The reading of poetry as well as part of, Thomas is writing prose. He's saying in How I Began that, poetry influenced his prose. And that I was struck by your mention of Frost's mention of Hyperion, Keats' Hyperion being influenced, because Hyperion is very clearly an influence on the autumnal passage in the Woodland Life, and also on Thomas's October poem, and that passage about in Hyperion about not a stir was there, as that is, and Thomas frequently refers to that. It made a big impression on him. So the overlap, Keats and Hardy, as well as much distinctive American and English influences.
Yeah, and also it's worth pointing out that Thomas at this point has different career paths ahead of him in some ways. Although his first book is a nature book, he's also somebody who's going to very quickly become a book reviewer, and that literariness will become a way of earning a living. And actually, it's going to be a few years before he does another country book, isn't it? It's going to be
Yes.
Heart of England.
Heart of England, yes.
Yeah, so his next books will be actually two books that are focused around Oxford, a book of essays and then a book about Oxford, and then a book about Wales, which is again a kind of a country book, but more framed as a travel book. So he's still trying to find what his literary career will be and what his voice will be. And in the Woodland Life, you've got a mixture of these possibilities: the literariness, the bookish young boy, and also the nature writer. And all of these will come into fruition and come back together, I suppose, when he becomes a poet 20 years later.
What's interesting is that Thomas mentions specific nature writers as influences, and we just don't see that in Frost. We know that he read Darwin's Origin of Species and The Voyage of the Beagle, and he read Wordsworth, and he loved Virgil's poetry and so forth. But these writers were not specifically, with the exception of Wordsworth and perhaps Keith, necessarily nature writers, where nature became mostly the dominant subject. And Frost's introduction to nature was from a kind of older big brother type named Carl Burrell, who had returned to high school to graduate 10 years after most people have graduated. And Burrell was something of a sophisticated farmer, if you will. He had read Darwin, he had read Huxley, and he had introduced Frost in high school to these books. And so Frost's first inclinations into the natural world were through this figure, this older mentor, who brought him into the woods around Lawrence, Massachusetts when he was in high school. And later on, Frost mentions that he loves people like Thoreau and Emerson as well. But the kind of tutoring in nature studies is not equivalent to what we see in Thomas. And I find that really, really striking. And I think that makes a big difference in the way in which each poet goes about describing the natural world. I mean, in October, for example, we see Thomas mentioning the names of multiple flora and fauna. And I think this was the legacy of what he was doing in the prose, where, the wanderer would go out into the woods, observe the flora and fauna, and then record them in a journal or in diary fashion. This was very consistent with 19th century models of nature writing. Frost didn't begin those quests until much later, and he kind of grew into his role as a nature poet as he refined his sensibilities. But Thomas's nature sensibilities were far more refined early in his career than Frost's ever were. Frost had to continually improve his observations of the natural world until he did become finally a fairly astute observer. I don't know where that's going, but something.
Let's ask you about, what point does Frost formulate his critical ideas about the importance of speech and the sentence sound? Because that is, when Thomas is in some way, it was actually altering his prose and criticizing his early or the ornateness of his earlier writing in How I Began, or is writing his critique of Walter Pater, which is an attack, a louding attack, not just on Pater's ideas, but on Pater's style and its remoteness from speech. And that's where he, writing to Frost, a letter to Frost, he said, when he tells Frost that he should write a book on speech and literature to stop Thomas doing it instead, and how his Pater book would show Frost he got on the scent of that already. But when did Frost get on the scent? Or was that, how important was that to the development of his poetry?
Well, it was extremely important. I mean, we see a few snatches of his mature style in A Boy's Will, with a poem like Mowing, for example. And I'm kind of convinced that in some respects, the Sound of Sense comes out of Darwin's discussions of language, and also later Bergson's discussions of language, where, tone and movement rather than individual words tends to speak volumes about human expression in ways that he hadn't considered before. So it's how Frost comes to this notion of the Sound of Sense is kind of a fascinating question. Virginia, do you have any ideas about Sound of Sense in terms of Darwin or Bergson and birdsong and so forth?
Oh, she's on mute.
I think you're muted, Virginia.
Yes, yeah, I think they're both important, especially. And here's there's some comments in the chat. We should come back to this idea: sound must have come before language, and I think the aim was song, right? So his poem, which I think actually harkens back to Lucretius also, this idea of wind blowing through reeds, just natural ones. And those were maybe the first flutes. And of course, then birds. And Darwin very much, was where how, animals communicated but you're right, this Marianne Husbands, as she says, the sound must precede the language. And same thing, I think Tom might, I was thinking about this idea of enacting you should be able to suss out the sense of action or of dialogue, right, by how people are moving and relating to each other. And so there's, and like his poem where he, was it time, or was it his famous story about Sound of Sense, about how he could like imagine what two people who were out of earshot were saying by the way their motions and things like that.
Yeah.
In terms of communicating by sound, I was wondering whether Robert Frost was particularly interested in music. Did he have
Not
any?
much. He liked sea shanties and ditties, but doesn't necessarily have any mention of favorite composers or music or anything like that. I actually tried to investigate that, and I just don't see a whole lot there. Someone like Bergson, for example, was fascinated by music, and the notes in some way were not the movement of what music constituted. And so they were discrete representations of notes, but it was the compilation of notes and the movements and patterns of music that so fascinated Bergson. And so he kind of felt, as Frost feels about the tones of language, that maybe it's the crescendos and decrescendos of the multiple possibilities of human tone that is more important in the dramatic constitutions of poetry. I also see Marianne Husband's comment that Frost was assigned the idea that he was a nature poet. And I think you're referring to one of his letters where he says, "I'm not a nature poet. There are always people in my poems." And I think that's absolutely true. But to suggest that Frost isn't a nature poet, I think would also be untrue, in the sense that we see him observing the natural world very coolly and keenly, especially after his interactions with Thomas. I think the great lyric movements of Frost were influenced by Thomas and Thomas's venturing out into the natural world in a way that Frost necessarily hadn't.
I just want to say, for all the excessive adjectival and adverbial heightening of the style of the Woodland Life, it does evoke not just the colours, but very much the sounds of the natural world, not just of birds, but of the effects of weather, of wind, and that runs through to the poems. The pure thrush word becoming some kind of epitome of the lyric. So I think Thomas's attentiveness to the sounds of nature is there from the beginning, even if his attentiveness to speech patterns took longer to develop. Well, do you think we should perhaps continue to the second?
Yes,
we're talking about the natural world and their approaches.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this comment from Marianne, who I can get into it properly. Says that, as we can read, Thomas may have had nature as the subject that enabled him to connect to human experience, and Frost used nature in the opposite. For her, Frost is, and I'll get there in a minute, sorry. I'm sorry, I can't read the rest of that, Marianne, at the moment.
Okay, I think I'm supposed to read the Vantage Point by Frost. I'll start with the Vantage Point.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find it in my,
Page 26.
yeah,
Might be a different font.
here it is. Whoops. The Vantage Point. If tired of trees, I seek again mankind. Well, I know where to hie me in the dawn, to a slope where the cattle keep the lawn. There, amid lolling juniper reclined, myself unseen, I see in white defined far off the homes of men, and farther still the graves of men on an opposing hill, living or dead, whichever are to mind. And if by noon I have too much of these, I have but to turn on my arm, and lo, the sunburned hillside sets my face aglow. My breathing shakes the bluet like a breeze. I smell the earth. I smell the bruised plant. I look into the crater of an ant.
And here's one of Edward Thomas's dialogue poems, which must have been influenced by Frost. The Chalk Pit. Is this the road that climbs above and bends round what was once a chalk pit? Now it is by accident and amphitheatre. Some ash trees standing ankle deep in briar and bramble act the parts and neither speak nor stir. But see, they've fallen every one. Briar and bramble have grown over them. That is the place. As usual, no one is here. Hardly can I imagine the drop of the axe and the smack that is like an echo sounding here. I do not understand. But what I mean is that I have seen the place 2 or 3 times at most, and that its emptiness and silence and stillness haunt me, as if just before it was not empty, silent, still, but full of life of some kind, perhaps tragical. Has anything unusual happened here? Not that I know of. It's called the Dell. They have not dug chalk here for a century. That was the ash tree's age. But I will ask, no, do not. I prefer to make a tale, or better, leave it like the end of a play, actors and audience and lights all gone, for so it looks now. In my memory, again and again I see it, strangely dark and vacant of a life, but just withdrawn. We have not seen the woodman with the axe. Some ghost has left it now as we two came. And yet you doubted if this were the road. Well, sometimes I've thought of it and failed to place it. No, I'm not quite sure even now this is it. For another place, real or painted, may have combined with it, or I myself a long way back in time. Well, as to that, I used to meet a man I had forgotten, searching for birds' nests along the road and in the chalk pit too. The wren's hole was an eye that looked at him for recognition. Every nest he knew. He got a stiff neck by looking this side or that, spring after spring, he told me, with his laugh. A sort of laugh. He was a visitor, man of 40, smoked and strolled about. At oughts and crosses, pleasure and pain had played on his brown features. I think both had lost. Mild and yet wild too, you may know the kind. Once or twice a woman shared his walks, a girl of 20 with a brown boy's face and hair brown as a thrush or as a nut. Thick eyebrows, glinting eyes. You have said enough. A pair, free thought, free love, I know the breed. I shall not mix my fancies up with them. You please yourself. I should prefer the truth or nothing. Here, in fact, is nothing at all, except a silent place that once rang loud, and trees and us, imperfect friends, we men and trees, since time began. And nevertheless, between us still, we breed a mystery.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read Frost's poem, Spring Pools. Absolutely one of my favorite Frost lyrics. It's a mature poem. It's almost perfect in its conception and its delivery. First poem in West Running Brook. Spring pools. These pools that, though in forests, still reflect the total sky almost without defect. And like the flowers beside them, chill and shiver, will like the flowers beside them soon be gone. And yet not out by any brook or river, but up by roots to bring dark foliage on. The trees that have it in their pent-up buds to darken nature and be summer woods, let them think twice before they use their powers to blot out and drink up and sweep away these flowery waters and these watery flowers from snow that melted only yesterday.
I'm going to read a spring poem by Thomas. We've moved seasons, and also a poem like Spring Pools, of close observation of the natural world. And Thomas's poem is, but these things also. But these things also are springs. On banks by the roadside, the grass, long dead, it is grayer now than all the winter it was. The shell of a little snail bleached in the grass, chip of flint and mite of chalk, and the small bird's dung in splashes of purest white. All the white things a man mistakes for earliest violets, who seeks through winter's ruins something to pay winter's debts. While the north blows and starling flocks, by chattering on and on, keep their spirits up in the mist, and spring's here, winter's not gone.
Okay, I'm going to read The Gum Gatherer by Frost. The Gum Gatherer. There overtook me and drew me into his downhill early morning stride and set me 5 miles on my road, better than if he had had me ride. A man with a swinging bag for a load and half the bag wound round his hand. We talked like barking above the din of water we walked along beside. And for my telling him where I'd been and where I lived in mountain land to be coming home the way I was, he told me a little about himself. He came from higher up in the pass, where the grist of the new beginning brooks is block split off the mountain mass, and hopeless grist enough it looks, enough to grind to soil for grass. The way it is will do for moss. There he had built his stolen shack. It had to be stolen, a stolen shack, because of the fears of fire and loss that trouble the sleep of lumber folk. Visions of half the world burned black and the sun shrunken yellow in smoke. We know who, when they come to town, bring berries under the wagon seat or a basket of eggs between their feet. What this man brought in a cotton sack was gum, the gum of the mountain spruce. He showed me lumps of the scented stuff, like uncut jewels, dull and rough. It comes to market golden brown, but turns to pink between the teeth. I told him, this is a pleasant life to set your breast to the bark of trees, that all your days are dim beneath, and reaching up with a little knife to loose the resin and take it down, and bring it to market where you please.
Here's another of Edward Thomas's country folk. Andrew Motion's just been talking about all these country figures that sort of appear out of the landscape and out of the woods and then disappear, or you're just left back in it. They're sort of, yes, strange archetypal figures that come into nature and fade away again. New Year. He was the one man I met up in the woods that stormy New Year's morning. And at first sight, 50 yards off, I could not tell how much of the strange tripod was a man. His body, bowed horizontal, was supported equally by legs at one end, by a rib at the other. Thus he rested, far less like a man than his wheelbarrow in profile was like a pig. But when I saw it was an old man bent, at the same moment came into my mind those games at which boys bend thus. High cockalorum, or fly the garter, and leapfrog. At the sound of footsteps, he began to straighten himself. His head rolled under his cape like a tortoise's. He took an unlit pipe out of his mouth politely, and I wished him a happy new year, and with his head cast upward sideways muttered, so far as I could hear through the trees roar, Happy New Year, may it come fastish too. And I strode by, and he turned to raking leaves.
I think, Virginia, you're up with an old man's winter.
That's, yep, thank you. Yep, I was muted. Yeah, I'm reading An Old Man's Winter Night, and this is from Mountain Interval, published in 1918. All out of doors look darkly in at him through the thin frost, almost in separate stars, that gathers on the pane in empty rooms. What kept his eyes from giving back the gaze was the lamp tilted near them in his hand. What kept him from remembering what it was that brought him to that creaking room was age. He stood with barrels round him at a loss, and having scared the cellar under him in clomping here, he scared it once again in clomping off, and scared the outer night, which has its sounds, familiar, like the roar of trees and crack of branches, common things, but nothing so like beating on a box. A light he was to no one but himself, where now he sat, concerned with he knew what, a quiet light, and then not even that. He consigned to the moon, such as she was so late arising, to the broken moon as better the sun in any case, for such a charge, his snow upon the roof, his icicles along the wall to keep, and slept. The log that shifted with a jolt once in the stove disturbed him, and he shifted and eased his heavy breathing, but still slept. One aged man, one man, can't keep a house, a farm, a countryside, or if he can, it's thus he does it of a winter night.
And here's Edward's House and Man. 1 hour. As dim he and his house now seem as a reflection in a rippling brook while I remember him. But first his house. Empty, it sounded. It was dark with forest boughs that brushed the walls and made the mossy tiles part of the squirrel's trap. In all those miles of forest silence and forest murmur, only one house. Lonely, he said, I wish it were lonely, which the trees looked upon from every side. That was his. He waved goodbye to hide a sigh that he converted to a laugh. He seemed to hang rather than stand there, half ghost-like, half a beggar's rag, clean wrung and useless on the briar. where it has hung long years, washing by sun and wind and rain. Why I call back man and house again is that now on a beech tree's tip I see, as then I saw, I at the gate and he in the house darkness, a magpie veering about, a magpie like a weathercock in doubt.
The quest of the purple fringed. I felt the chill of the meadow underfoot, but the sun o'erhead, and snatches of verse or song of scenes like this I sung or said. I skirted the margin alders for miles and miles in a sweeping line. The day was the day by every flower that blooms, but I saw no sign. Yet further I went before the scythes should come, for the grass was high, till I saw the path where the slender fox had come and gone panting by. Then at last, and following that, I found in the very hour when the color flushed the petals, it must have been the far sought flower. There stood the purple spires with no breath of air or headlong bee to disturb their perfect poise the livelong day, 'neath the alder tree. I only knelt and putting the boughs aside, looked, or at most, counted them all to the buds in the copper depth, pale as a ghost. Then I arose and silent wandered home, and I, for one, said that the fall might come and whirl of leaves, for summer was done.
The ash grove. Half of the grove stood dead, and those that yet lived made little more than the dead ones made of shade. If they led to a house long before they had seen its fall, but they welcomed me. I was glad without cause and delayed. Scarce 100 paces under the trees was the interval, paces each sweeter than sweetest miles, but nothing at all, not even the spirits of memory and fear with restless wings, would climb down in to molest me over the wall that I passed through at either end without noticing. And now an ash grove far from those hills can bring the same tranquility in which I wander a ghost with a ghostly gladness, as if I heard a girl sing the song of the ash grove, soft as love uncrossed, and then in a crowd or in distance it were lost. But the moment unveiled something unwilling to die, and I had what most I desired, without search or desert or cost.
The word tranquility in that poem does send us back to Wordsworth and Thomas's consciousness of Wordsworth and the epiphany, of which this is a very ghostly and substantial epiphany, but nonetheless an epiphany. And you know, some of those other poems by both of them are very conscious of where they're coming from in relation to nature or landscape. But I just wondered, are you, do we sense a difference in that self-consciousness in or about that what I call that pastoral? Is there a difference? We'll talk further about American or Anglo-American differences in that way.
I think one of the largest differences that I see in Frost's version of pastoral and Thomas's version is that Thomas seems far willing to go deeper into wilderness in his poems. There's a willingness to kind of confront the darkness of the most barren and remote parts of nature. And Frost is someone who's always sort of skirting along the edge of that location, that kind of locus. You know, there's always the call and the pull of community or civilization back. And so what we see in both of them is, you know, figures going out and back and out and back. But I think Thomas is far more fascinated with removing himself from human community in some ways. And Frost is someone who's always starved for human community. And we see this obviously in a poem like The Vantage Point, where if he wants to go out because he's had too much surfeit of human community, he goes out into the woods. And if he's had too much of the woods, he can always come back and recover and resuscitate himself with the people he loves. I think Thomas's journey is far more lonely in the woods. And maybe I'm wrong, but I'm wondering if anyone can comment on that.
I'm just very fascinated that in all this sequence of poems, I've never been so conscious of ghostliness. And it's not just, sometimes it's the poet's consciousness that is a ghost. He wants to be a ghost or is a ghost or has a ghostly glance. And sometimes it's the man, the strange man in the house who's, I mean, that strange description of him being like a beggar's rag, useless on a briar that's been left. And so sometimes the figures are ghosts that just appear and materialize and disappear. And he himself is sort of almost wanting to be in that sort of, it's a very free state. It's almost sort of getting rid of sort of mortality and substantiality to enter the world of the imagination. Or I've just got to be very careful with my strange pronouncements. But
I suppose it captures a little bit of what Marianne's just said there. Is it this escape from or freedom of?
It's interesting as well that it, from what Bob was saying, that seems the reverse of our usual idea of the difference between American and British nature.
Yes.
America is normally offered up to us as a place that's got much more wilderness, much more open space, and even a sense of things untouched by mankind. That's probably untrue, but nonetheless, that's an idea. Whereas in England, certainly, it's quite hard to find wilderness. And Thomas was indeed, as you say, trying to escape in ways, but he's often escaping into areas that were actually quite heavily populated. Maybe if you go to Scotland and so forth, you might get more of an idea of the sublime, of the wild, but we would normally think of that as something that America has much more access to.
What's interesting, Guy, is you're right. I mean, England had been pretty much denuded by the time print culture came into being. And but what's I find so interesting about American nature writing is even if wilderness, a genuine wilderness, is available, almost all of American literature inhabits that pastoral space between the city and wilderness itself. It's not until we get into later 20th century writers like Edward Abbey, for example, where we have these individuals who are really trying to go out into the deepest recesses of the natural world. So, in Cooper, for example, Natty Bumppo is always going between, the Native Americans and the civilized domestic dwellings where people are inhabiting. Hester and Dimsdale meet in that location between the Indian camp and the Puritan village. And I think this is the space that Frost inhabits as well. He was someone who was quite comfortable taking forays into the city, and he often went into, New York or Chicago, but he always returned to that kind of pastoral space, the farm. which was consistent with Jefferson and Crèvecoeur and, that space where we're comfortable, we're removed from the city, but we're not isolated and in wilderness itself. And so it seems to me that characterizes American literature a little bit more than that sense of wilderness always being available and people entering into it voluntarily.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, part of the whole story of
Mhm.
America, the American story, though, is us pushing out against this wilderness
Mhm.
and redefining, places that used to be wilderness. It's funny, you look back at the settings now of, around Salem or, in Eastern Massachusetts where, the Hawthorne's book took place, or, where the Scarlet Letter or his short stories. And you're right, there were all these, like the young Goodman Brown, this trek through the woods to this demon's camp in the wilderness. And who knows whom you might meet there. But today, of course, it's all suburbs. And this is what we've been doing ever since we came here, is just pushing back, and places that used to be wilderness, we have just slowly encroached on and turned it into perhaps this margin land of the wild and the domestic.
There's a good comment on the chat from Lila Belcora, who's an expert on frost and astronomy. And she makes that point that there is the deep wilderness of space and stars, perhaps, even if there isn't the wilderness underneath your feet, it might be above your head.
Yes.
And I'm also fascinated by Mary Ann's comment as well. Either nothing is nature or everything is nature or both. And she says she's echoing Timothy Morton. We have that line in October, I believe, where Thomas is talking about the mystery of the relationship between men and trees. That sense of non-human nature or human nature, and where do we bifurcate the difference? And you would you might cite mental activity as being the delineation between that which is nature, that other, and us. But we also know that the landscape, the natural environments in which we live, help shape our own sensibilities, help shape mind and affect our interpretation. So the way that, the idea that we can ever completely sever ourselves from nature, I think is false. The other thing that I like about both of these writers is that there's a hard material nature in their writing. It's not like Emerson, for example, where the natural world is always subordinated to mental activity or the idea of nature and interpretation. In Frost and Thomas, there's a hard natural space that pushes back against mental activities and resists it. And we see this, this acknowledgement of a real tangible world available to sensory perception.
If you think that as Thomas starts out, as a naturalist, as all those field dirt books, 100 of them, you were told the other day, whereas Frost does seem, in speaking as some kind of a farmer and somebody who works with and on trees, and there's someone cutting them down, or that seems to me a different base, even up to agree of how the concreteness of the observation and the work and how that's felt in the rhythm of the poems. But with Thomas, you get some gardening poems, sowing and digging, but not so much of the harder outdoor work that Frost seems to be doing. Thomas, in a letter to Walter Delamere around 1908, 1909, said bluntly, "I don't separate man from nature." I think man is very little part of nature and the part I enjoy least. So that's really putting man in his place. And Thomas was keen, to put the human in its place. And the chalk pit, there are these different ways of approaching or conceiving the natural world, whether it make a tale or make a play or fancy, and those are all rejected, in favor of some kind of mystery in relation to the earth and to trees. Do you think Frost really thought man and nature were one, or does he hold, as in vantage point, see them as slightly different spheres? That is an old that poem. You look at men, you look at the natural world.
Yeah.
But with the natural world, there is this strange, this is one thing that I've only just seen in October, and we've been talking today, Michael and everybody, about how the poems keep on coming up with fresh insights and things. But when he talks about the change of nature and the annual cycle, he mentions 4 flowers that are blooming in their full life. The rose and the violet, the harebell and snowdrop. You'd expect he'd have a sort of dying plant or something deadly going on at some time, but it's somehow the annual cycle always has its freshness and newness that he would like to change, like the year, just to have suddenly get better again, or flower at different times, whereas the human cycle, of course, is a whole lifetime, has its spring, summer, autumn and winter. And there seems to be some sort of that part of the ground for the dis-ease, the uncomfortableness.
Virginia, you were going to say?
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say was that it seemed to me that Frost continuously tries to put man in his place and remind us that we are part of something bigger. Because I was thinking, I'm trying to think, Bob, do you know the poem where he kind of muses that we're kind of like just a layer of pond scum or something on the player.
Well,
he's musing about the thickness of the Earth's crust, and but also our hold on the planet is another one. And but yeah, I think he's constantly reminding a man that nature will have the last word,
right.
and that we're not going to win, whatever that is.
Well, I think, when we think about Frost, I think we have to follow William James's lead, and I always bring up this idea when I speak about Frost, and I use a line from Wallace Stevens to talk about him. The violence from within protects us from the violence from without, so there is a very stern, hard, assaulting natural environment that, we try to cultivate and tame in some respect. And it's through our interpretations and the mental interpretations of the physical world that we're able to achieve some kind of stasis. So this is, the foundation, I think, of human activity and civilization. So the danger, I think, for Frost is when either side culminate in some sort of excess where the mind no longer has the capability of fending off natural assaults, or the mind itself becomes so excessive in a kind of neurosis or neuroses where the excesses of the imagination completely distort the qualities of the natural world. So there's this, incredible relationship going on, this play between mind and matter that I really, really love in Robert Frost. And I'm seeing a lot of that in Thomas as well.
Frost is our hold on the planet. And in one of the poems he says we might have just 1% possibility of humans prevailing, over the natural world. He does seem to be in some kind of assault mode or mode of resistance, to wildness and wilderness and weather represents. Whereas Thomas perhaps doesn't seem looks forward almost equanimity to the natural, to the non-human nature prevailing, but in both of them indeed there is the house and there is forest, there's the house and the trees, and there's a tension played out in different ways in different poems.
Yeah, I was going to say the one other poem I was thinking of on this theme is from West Running Brook called Writers, where he says the surest thing is we are writers, and though none too successful at it, guiders through everything presented, land and tide, and now the very air that we ride. And this idea we are being mounted bareback on the earth. We can see the infant up astride, his small fist buried in a bushy hide. So yes, this idea that we are just, we're humans, we're just along for the ride. And this is a headless horse. He says, there is our wildest mount, a headless horse. And though it runs unbridled off its course, and all our blandishments would seem defied, we have ideas yet that we haven't tried. So that's, for me, yeah, he very much is always reminding us.
Sounds like almost a good point, Son. And Jim Hurley's mentioned there, Tree at My Window, which coincidentally we're going to be looking at in the next section. So hopefully that will follow up on your comment there, Jim.
Just wanted to say the dereliction of parts of rural England to political forces, which Thomas represents in poems like the Mill Water, where the mill has been abandoned and there's only the sounds left of water falling changelessly, calling where once men had a workplace and a home. That it seems more than a certain rural occupation is gone. It almost seems prophetic, something to do with the war, but even beyond the war, in that sense, we're not going to be here all that long on the planet.
Yeah.
Rural degradation is a big part of north of Boston, so we tend to think of pastoral poems as being a refuge from urban life and a great connection with nature and leisure time, a celebration of odium and a connection to a specific place. But, there's an anti-pastoral tradition in English poetry. And it seems to me that in Frost, he really is recording some of that rural degradation, that perhaps you're seeing in rural life in England as well, Edna. And, where life in rural areas is far more hardscrabble and difficult than the ancients ever made it out to be. And so you could be, have your head awash in kind of the romantic visions of nature that the great writers have given us. But when you have to go out and live it, and this is what happened to Frost when he moved to the dairy farm, nature and rural spaces become far more difficult to manage. They're isolating, they're hardscrabble. You have to find a lot of different ways to cultivate the land to make a living. And we see that quite a bit in Frost's sense of pastoral.
Mhm.
Thank you. Just before we move on, Norma asked the question a bit earlier. Did Frost write poems in England?
Yes, I think he wrote most of north of Boston while he was in England. The first year especially helped revise some of those poems. I mean, I think one of the myths is that Frost had written most of north of Boston prior to him moving to England. And I think that's not true. I think it's almost as if Frost had to live among the English so that he could better hear his own native idioms. And so the difference in language use, I think made him and Eleanor somewhat nostalgic for the life that they had left behind. So it wasn't until they were away from Vermont and New Hampshire that they really began to hear the speaking tones of the human voice that comprised almost all the poems of North of Boston.
Great, thank you.
So yeah, I think we were going to move on to think about the symbolism of trees, and trees sometimes being ominous or threatening, in fact, and mysterious as well. Just wanted to mention a little bit in the childhood debate with Thomas, just before we get around to the poems, actually, because he talks there about how important Grimm's fairy tales were for him. And there, of course, we get the power of the forest and the woods, which we might see even influencing Thomas's poetry. So he says there, for instance, that I cannot decide whether my life owed more to my books or my books more to my life. I slipped from one world into the other as easily as from room to room. I do not know how much I may have dwelt on the story in later years, but Grimm's Hansel and Gretel, the children going out into the wood to be lost, dropping a trail of stones behind them and finding their way back, but failing to do so when they used breadcrumbs which the birds ate, came to be, to my mind, one of the great stories of the world. And you could, of course, if we're looking at the poems then that Thomas ends up writing, you could think perhaps of Lights Out, where we begin, I have come to the borders of sleep, the unfathomable deep forest where all must lose their way, however straight or winding, soon or late. So there is this theme in Thomas of forest as places to get lost in, but also then a metaphorical forest, and maybe it is sleep, maybe it is death, and a haunting that trees can offer us, possibly through the sound of trees. There's also, for instance, a strange little dream that Thomas writes about in his piece called Fiction, which was a novel he didn't publish, which is about his teenage years. He talks about himself, essentially, fictionalized version of himself as a 13 or 14-year-old boy. Hearing the line, the child is father to the man, slightly misquoted bit of Wordsworth there. And he then has this dream about going into a forest. The result was a dream that very night. In my dream, I flew through a twilight until I reached a forest of enormous trees. Here I alighted and began to walk into the wood in search of something, seeking without knowing what, and going deeper into the forest. I noticed that I was not alone. Other boys and girls were flitting hither and thither among the trees, singly without a word or a sign of communication with one another. A few were older, many were much younger than I. Some, like myself, were looking about them. Others had found what they sought. These, when I passed them, I saw to be sitting or kneeling beside cradles, rocking them or singing or gazing intently. The children were very much like the angels of resurrection which I had seen over tombs. What was inside the cradles at first sight terrified me. Several that I saw were very old, bearded, emaciated, and grim or death-like instead of babies, grown men. All were asleep. I was, however, soon relieved. The child is father to the man, said one of the tenders of cradles in a pause in his song. Instantly I understood everything. These were children tending the men and the old men to whom they were fathers. I was a father. What I was in search of was my son. After some wandering among nurseless cradles, I recognized him by some unsuspected instinct. A pallid, mustached old baby. I bent down to look more closely. With a scream, I hid my eyes. All had been in vain. My son was dead. And here ended the dream, but not the growth of that seed sown by Wordsworth's poem, he says. So this remarkable kind of little, slightly comic, slightly gothic moment of going into the forest and discovering your son, who is your father, with a mustache and who is also dead. So as I think, as Don said when we were talking about it the other week, this is one for Freud. I think that dream. But we've also been thinking about the sound of trees and the way that they can take on this haunting quality and actually come to represent some kind of threshold or transition into another world as well, in a form of escapism that trees somehow offer us. That becomes quite clear in a little prose piece that Thomas published called The Inn by the Aspen, which he published actually in the Westminster Gazette not long before he started writing poetry. It was published on the 4th of July, 1914. And here we might get something that echoes maybe a poem that Frost wrote later in that year, which was The Sound of Trees, which again might lead into a poem, Aspens, which we're going to hear from Tom in a moment. I'm not going to read all of The Inn by the Aspen, but I'll just read the beginning of it and the end of it. I turned back. I could not fly or ride, neither could I walk far enough really to taste that country northward. The angry sea of bare mountains, waves behind waves, greater and lesser, which the sun out of the one window among the clouds seemed to be counting. For a pale hand of light fell upon now one and now another. I should like to have ridden on over them for a day and a night, and since that was impossible, I turned back and went down. It was the time when the brown bent stalks of the foxgloves were tipped with the last flowers. Up there, I had only swallows about me, but as I went rapidly down, I came to where the grass was dotted by very white sheep, then to the grey ruins of a cottage, and another, each one watched over by an ash tree, and to the brook. And at length the road crossed the brook, and by the bridge stood the Red Lion, with one aspen beside it. The inn had a plain stone front and a simple pillared porch. The tree was tall and beautiful, though trimmed far up almost to its triple fork. Thus the inn suffered no shadow. In fact, at that moment the sun shone full into the porch and upon the collier asleep on the step. The river and the bridge, the tree and the inn, at the edge of that village, under the mountains, were worthy of a more heroic arrival. However, I stepped over the dog and entered the cool tap room. It was silent, except for the aspen shaking. It was empty. I seemed to have come too late, years, perhaps centuries too late. And what happens is that Thomas then talks about stepping into this inn, and it's almost like going back in time. He says, it's the kind of room that could be used for Alfred and the Cakes or King John signing the charter. There is this sense of the aspen, the only noise that can be heard, somehow ushering in another age or another world. This then, though, is broken when a motorist turns up. So again, this is a classic Thomas thing of going back in time and the natural world suddenly being invaded. He's becoming very interested in motor cars around this time, as a lot of people were. And the motorist is not only an invasion in terms of noise with a machine, but also a class invasion. He's someone quite posh, he's called the gentleman, and gets into a conversation with the barmaid. And the story ends really with the barmaid complaining about this class of person. We have a lot to put up with from that class of person, she says. They think they do us a favour by paying for what they drink, and they expect favours in return. If they have a horse shod at the smithy now and then, they expect the blacksmith to put his hands under his apron and admire their children blowing away his fire and mislaying his tools, so long as they have nothing better to do. Because the blacksmith is patient, they think he likes it. I am civil when they press me for a favour, but they don't think so. But they're these rich people that get about, don't understand anything but money. They are a lot of children, and they think the country people are too. You wouldn't catch them doing that sort of thing in London. But they are on their holidays, and they think we are all in a picture book, like that old dog out on the step. Perhaps I laughed excessively and made her feel that she had been talking too much. For with "this will never do for me," she disappeared through the bar, and again I heard the aspen shaking. So I slipped out over the collie and set forth again with my back to the mountains. And that's how the little passage ends. So the aspen is there at the beginning and the end. It's like the collie. The collie is the dog, of course, sleeping on the step. You have to step over the dog, but he's slipping into another world and then leaving it at the end. And it's that aspen shaking, which might be the moment perhaps for us to turn to aspens.
Yes. All day and night, save winter, every weather, above the inn, the smithy and the shop, the aspens at the crossroads talk together of rain until their last leaves fall from the top. Out of the blacksmith's cabin comes the ringing of hammer, shoe and anvil. Out of the inn, the clink, the hum, the roar, the random singing, the sounds that for these 50 years have been. the whisper of the aspens is not drowned, and over lightless pane and footless road, empty as sky, with every other sound not ceasing, calls their ghosts from their abode. A silent smithy, a silent inn, nor fails in the bare moonlight or the thick-furred gloom, in tempest or the night of nightingales, to turn the crossroads to a ghostly room. And it would be the same were no house near. Over all sorts of weather, men and times, aspens must shake their leaves, and men may hear, but need not listen more than to my rhymes. Whatever wind blows, while they and I have leaves, we cannot other than an aspen be, that ceaselessly, unreasonably grieves, or so men think who like a different tree.
You're muted, Bob.
I'll come back. That was a new interpretation, by the way.
It's the sound of silence.
Sorry, I'm muted, sorry. I was saying that, Tom, that reading was just spectacular. I wish all classically trained actors read all poems all the time.
Well, that's a new interpretation from today, because I've suddenly realized that he's much more aggressive, and I mean, it is the poet who is desperate to communicate and save the world or whatever, and nobody bothers, and the aspens are his great symbol. I suddenly realized it's quite an aggressive and significant. So yes, different interpretations, different days, but I was quite pleased with that.
And greatly appreciated by everyone by the seams. So thank you. I think we've lost Bob for a moment, so it might be over to you, Virginia.
Okay, I'm happy to read. Yeah, so I was going to read Tree at My Window, and this is from West Running Brook. And once again, we're going to hear about trees talking here. Tree at my window, window tree. My sash is lowered when night comes on, but never let there be curtain drawn between you and me. Vague dream head lifted out of the ground, and thing next most to cloud, used to cloud, not all of your light tongues talking aloud could be profound. But tree, I have seen you taken and tossed, and if you have seen me when I slept, you have seen me when I was taken and swept and all but lost. That day she put our heads together, fate had her imagination about her. Your head so much concerned with outer, mine with inner weather.
Shall I go into those two
Yes.
poems? There are two poems here. Go to the hollow. Yes, we were going to have birches from Don Wayne.
Yes.
Refer to it.
Yes, right. The hollow wood. Out in the sun, the goldfinch flits along the thistle tops, flits and twits above the hollow wood, where birds swim like fish, fish that laugh and shriek to and fro far below in the pale hollow wood. Lichen, ivy and moss keep evergreen the trees that stand half flayed and dying, and the dead trees on their knees in dog's mercury, ivy and moss. And the bright twig of the goldfinch drops down there as he flits on thistle tops. And dark is the forest, and deep, and overhead hang stars of, dark is the forest and deep, and overhead hang stars like seeds of light in vain, though not since they were sown was bred anything more bright. And evermore mighty multitudes ride about nor enter in. Of the other multitudes that dwell inside, never yet was one seen. The forest foxglove is purple, the marguerite outside is gold and white, nor can those that pluck either blossom greet the others day or night.
So until we get far to that, should we discuss we could have those two poems, maybe to end things, the further two, the Green Roads, and maybe we should discuss what's just been read.
Yes, I think so.
Get,
He's coming
is
back
he
in.
coming back?
Yeah. Just about to send him the link again. But
Remember, loosely heading that last group poem and prose under the heading symbolism, and, there as well.
No, it's not. It's
Yes,
must be
There's a
great.
date on there.
and we didn't manage to read Birch's, Bob. We haven't heard Birch's, so perhaps.
Okay, I'll happily read it. One of Frost's most famous poems, and I never tire of it ever. It's such a beautiful thing. Another one of my favorites here. Let me just quickly pull it up. Sorry about that. I apologize for my technology. It just all of a sudden crapped out and I don't know why. Birches. When I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straighter, darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them. But swinging doesn't bend them down to stay as ice storms do. Often you must have seen them loaded with ice a sunny winter morning after a rain. They click upon themselves as the breeze rises and turn many-colored as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. Soon the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust, such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They are dragged to the withered bracken by the load, and they seem not to break, though once they are bowed so low for long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arching in the woods years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun. But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm, I should prefer to have some boy bend them as he went out and in to fetch the cows, some boy too far from town to learn baseball, whose only play was what he found himself, summer or winter, and could play alone. One by one, he subdued his father's trees by riding them down over and over again until he took the stiffness out of them. And not one but hung limp, not one was left for him to conquer. He learned all there was to learn about not launching out too soon, and so not carrying the tree away clear to the ground. He always kept his poise to the top branches, climbing carefully with the same pains you use to fill a cup up to the brim and even above the brim. Then he flung outward feet first with a swish, kicking his way down through the air to the ground. So was I once myself a swinger of birches, and so I dream of going back to be. It's when I'm weary of considerations and life is too much like a pathless wood where your face burns and tickles with the cobwebs broken across it, and one eye is weeping from a twigs having lashed it across it open. I'd like to get back from earth for a while and then come back to it and begin over. May no feet willfully misunderstand me and half grant what I wish and snatch me away not to return. Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. I'd like to go by climbing a birch tree and climb black branches up a snow white trunk toward heaven till the tree could bear no more, but dipped its top and set me down again. That would be good, both going and coming back. One could do worse than be a swinger of birches.
Perfect. So you thought that this section should feature the Ars Poetica poems, as you might call them, to do with trees. And actually it is extraordinary to juxtapose aspens and birches and what they might imply about the art of those poets. Is it right to see the difference between the birches and the straighter, darker trees as being something to do with the sentence sound being played and drawn and displayed across spaces of the footed line? Is Frost saying something about the rhythm through representing, as he does in such wonderful rhythms, the riding of the birches?
Yeah, the going out and the coming back, and you know, it's amazing. You know, it's that sense, I think, where, you know, there's this play between the imagination and reality here, I think, where, you know, the fact of the ice storms and all of our truth breaks in to disrupt the reverie. But, you know, one of the things that I think we have to think about is that the ice storm in this poem is also imagined. It's not simply a fact, it's a fact that the poet has carefully chosen, and to set up this kind of contest or a conflict between the imagination and reality, where the poet is subduing nature and nature is again pushing back. I don't know too much about the sentence sounds in this poem. Virginia, do you have anything you want to add?
And you also get a sense of the poem being written, you know, through the evocation of the boy of the riding the branches. So it does seem very reflexive and a reflexive poem in that way, just as the Thomas Aspen poem whispers and with such power. You know.
Right.
Do any birches get broken?
They can. You know, I used to do this myself when I was a kid. And, you know, you have to find that sweet spot where if you climb too high, you're going to tumult down to the earth and very quickly. So you kind of have to gauge yourself. You can't quite get to the top of the tree, because to get to the top of the tree might mean you would be breaking them. But I did this all the time when I was a kid, usually with young dogwoods rather than birches. So I'm very fond of this poem because I know exactly what Frost is talking about here.
Actually, in an early review of poetry, very early, Thomas compared the lyric poem not to an aspen but to a birch, and it talked about the lyrics intricacies of form as numerous and as exquisite as those of a birch tree sighing in the wind. A very different kind of birch to Frost birches, but it's again, they are both going back to that, you know, romantic, you know, make me thy lyre, even as the forest is, but they take it in such new directions and complex directions in their poems.
I also like the, when you look at the bark of birches and, it's almost as if there are hieroglyphs in black against the dark white of the birch trunk. And, that sense of being inscribed by generations of peeling and enduring and so forth. So I can see why Frost is fascinated by birches.
Mhm. Yeah, Jim Hurley has a nice comment in here about the birches as well. Something must, quoting William James, something must give way. A native hardness must break down and liquefy.
Yeah. But you don't want it to break down too far, Jim, because then you're going to break your ankle.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say sorry, and it's this, the partner poem with this Wild Grapes too has this, some of the same imagery, of course, because she's the little girl she didn't climb the tree, I guess, to get the wild grapes, but she was lifted up there and then kind of stuck up there. But yeah, it's that same tension.
I don't know how far do we want to go into this dark forest Guy was talking about, and the more I think of it, the more extraordinary the opening of Thomas's really strange poem. The other is it begins, the forest ended. What does that suggest about what's behind the poem or what's in the poem?
Yes, there's often that theme in Thomas as well of going off into the woods. I mean, there's even the attempt with him going off, contemplating suicide and so on, and even going right back to Hansel and Gretel, and these scary stories really for children of forests and woods, which Thomas never really lives. And I think there's even a bit of that in birches, isn't there? And certainly in aspens, there's that kind of haunting
Ghosts again, Tom. Yeah.
ghosts.
Well, it seems the aspens have some sort of agency which is going to outlast, as people have been saying, it's going to outlast these human buildings and things. So it's
Yes.
The lovers are always going into woods and coming out of woods, and they're almost settings for some of the poems.
Yes.
And also whole earth is a ghostly room, at the end of Aspens. We vanished at that point. But then on the unconscious, and there have been some interpretations of the hollow wood as representing as representing the unconscious or dark places in the psyche, because of these dead trees and this image of a flayed human body. And
was that strange thing of the goldfinch, which I haven't, I mean, it seems a very, very slight poem, but it was only just that the goldfinch's voice drops down into this very dark place where all the trees are dying and the dark wood is all death and negative things. And just this little spirit is hopping around over the top. And then there's the dark forest, which I hope I put the in vain bit in vain is a very common bit of Edward Toller's, that the stars are like seeds of light that are sown in vain. They're trying to get through to the darkness, whatever the stars are represented in symbols. They're trying to get through into the dark mess of humanity and nature and the human predicament, and they can't do it. And there's these two forces of the multitude. What multitude inside is that the greater company of the dead or another multitude?
I think Thomas did wonder whether the dark forest was too symbolic or too obviously symbolic. He thought it might be too much like Maurice Maeterlinck, but I don't think so.
There's also the concept of dead trees in Thomas as well, and always again that lingering other most original, I suppose, of symbolisms of trees, which is the Garden of Eden. And there's a little poem called The Wasp Trap by Thomas, which ends with the dead apple bough, doesn't it? And
yes.
The dead tree, and it also happens to be an apple tree, just to give you a little bit of other possible suggestiveness. And yeah, I mean, again, because to get back to the kind of depression or symbolism. How much do we want to be literal about these things, or have a kind of allegorical interpretation, or how much do we want to try and avoid these straightforward interpretations of saying, oh, the forest is his head, or depression, or death, or what have you.
Or in Tree at My Window, the tree is a brain. That was, we are just in my little block of flats where we have a management group, and they want to cut down a fairly positive cherry tree just about 20 feet from my window and 20 feet from somebody else's window. And somebody says, oh, it's outgrown, its roots are all too, this is a little garden with a little bit of grass. We don't want all these roots all over the place. Take the whole thing down, take it out. And, oh no, prune it please, you can prune it a bit if you like. They're splitting all the old people in these blocks of flats. And there's a deaf lady who's only deaf in the last 2 years, but she's still lip breathes and she's so alive. She says, that tree is my life. That tree outside my window is, if that goes, I've had it done. So I sent her the copy of Tree at the Window just to say, there you are, Sheila.
Maybe send a Binsey Bumpers for Jeremy.
I know, we're having quite a campaign, and we don't know till the 10th of October which way the vote is going. One of the ladies on the top deck says, I hate living in this tree house, and it's 20 feet away from my window, brushing leaves on the window or anything. I hate living in a tree house. And the other person says, I don't like all the branches waving. Oh.
The Thomas could be very negative about trees. There's his poem Wind and Mist.
The raw.
Very disturbed poem, or a poem about disturbance, and taking some comment on this hilltop house which he hated. He says, I am back again of the intolerable swishing of trees and the wind and rain.
Well,
it's really got to.
The barmaid just can't stand. I want to die and go to a place where there's no trees making all this hell of a racket. And he can't even hear what the man's saying on New Year because of the roar of the trees. So yes, it's two ways of looking at everything. It's not more than two.
Well, yeah, especially with Thomas.
Jim, do you have anything to say about Tree at My Window? I know it's your favorite Frost poem. I'm just curious if you want to chat a message to us. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut that discussion off.
Well, yeah, because I remember, and Jim gave a very good reading of Tree at My Window. I think that event in San Diego, it was a Zoom event you were at, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very, very nice.
Well, that was a PBS interview, and I was pleased to read my favorite piece of all. And what all of this reminds me of, I'm just sitting here entranced at these readings and the discussion, and what it points to me is this line of Frost in a letter where he said, and this speaks to the Edward Thomas brief but intense friendship in a way that I haven't seen matched. And Frost says, and friends are everything.
Mm-hmm.
For what have we wings but to seek friends at an altitude? And, it's just such a crisp summary of the deep intrinsic value of intense friendships. It's just beautiful. And the Tree at My Window just binds ourselves to nature and to this. We must succumb at some point, perhaps to the primacy of nature, perhaps to just simply to our wonder at it. And it says such a crucial unifying factor in human relationships, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you. But that's my favorite of all Frost poems. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. I mean, I love that comment where you said just the wonder of it all. Bill McKibben has not Bill McKibben. Oh gosh, Virginia, help me out. Who's the great entomologist who studied ants?
Oh, E.O. Wilson.
E.O. Wilson has this term he calls biophilia. You know, that sense where when we're young, we fall in love with and we become fascinated with the flora and fauna of the natural world. And as we grow older and our obligations remove us from nature, we tend to sever that tie. And one of the great joys of my life was having a son whom I could take out into the woods and into the streams and just begin looking at things again and again. And that connection that we have is not just an aesthetic connection, but it also ties us to the matrix of all being. And I love that in both Frost and Thomas.
Which is possibly the point to stop.
Two more
This
pages.
time Bob was going to do come in.
Shall we have these poems,
Was going to be,
and then
we want come in, Woodland, the Green Roads, and then the need of being birthed.
yes.
Come in. Okay. As I came to the edge of the woods, thrush music, hark! Now, if it was dusk outside, inside it was dark. Too dark in the woods for a too dark in the woods for a bird by sleight of wing to better its perch for the night, though it still could sing. The last of the light of the sun that had died in the west still lived for one more song in a thrush's breast. Far in the pillared dark, thrush music went, almost like a call to come in to the dark and lament. But no, I was out for stars. I would not come in. I meant not even if asked, and I hadn't been. Great little ball. Okay. Virginia, do you want to read the need of being versed?
So that was going to be the last one. We'll do the Green Roads.
Tom, Green Roads would, or let's see.
Yeah, the Green Roads, and then the need of being birthed.
Okay.
The green, as it goes back to Hansel and Gretel again, and white feathers. I've suddenly realised white feathers. I even thought of Rupert Brooke. Not that he had a white feather, but the green roads that end in the forest are strewn with white goose feathers this June, like marks left behind by someone gone to the forest to show his track. He has never come back. Down each green road, a cottage looks at the forest. Round one the nettle towers, two are bathed in flowers. An old man along the green road to the forest strays from one, from another a child alone. In the thicket bordering the forest all day long, a thrush twiddles his song. It is old, but the trees are young in the forest, all but one, like a castle keep in the middle deep. That oak saw the ages pass in the forest. They were a host, but their memories are lost, for the tree is dead. All things forget the forest, excepting perhaps me, when now I see the old man, the child, the goose feathers at the edge of the forest, and hear all day long the thrush repeat his song.
So, yeah, close with the need of being versed in country things. The house had gone to bring again to the midnight sky a sunset glow. Now the chimney was all of the house that stood, like a pistol after the petals go. The barn opposed across the way that would have joined the house in flame had it been the will of the wind, was left to bear forsaken the place's name. No more it opened with all one end for teams that came by the stony road to drum on the floor with scurrying hooves and brush the mow with the summer load. The birds that came to it through the air at broken windows flew out and in, their murmur more like the sigh we sigh from being too much dwelling on what has been. Yet for them, the lilac renewed its leaf, and the aged elm, though touched with fire, and the dry pump flung up an awkward arm, and the fence post carried a strand of wire. For them, there was really nothing sad, but though they rejoiced in the nest they kept, one had to be versed in country things not to believe the phoebes wept.
Yeah, so
We don't have feelings, do we?
we've talked about that. Thank you very much, Virginia and Bob, and give our best wishes to Don. Sorry he couldn't be with us.
That I will do.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody for watching us and listening to us and giving us some thoughts along the way as well, and for your grateful thanks. We're very grateful to have you here with us as well. I must just put a plug in at the end for the Arts Council and National Lottery players, without whose help and support we wouldn't be bringing this to you. But yeah, I was amazed, enthused, excited, frightened, I suppose, at times, with that amazing range that we of readings and the actual extra that is within those poems, that only comes from reading them several times. So thank you all, and to all a good night.
He's mentioned on our one of the war memorials, it was the Hampshire Regiment, First World War, and suddenly it said G.E. Clapp. Now, was that G.E. Clapp, Gordon, or not? You might have an ancestor in Hampshire.
I'll have to write.
Happy birthday to Gordon. It was about 2 or 3 days ago, I think. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Good. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
And maybe we'll make a date for this time next year.
2 years, right? Or is it?
Well,
It's gonna do every year.
the festival is now every 2 years, but if I can persuade everybody, we'll have a study day on a Saturday and still continue these discussions, because as we said earlier, we can discuss for 1,000 years and we won't reach the end.
Right. And thank you all for setting this up. Edna, Jeremy, everybody who was involved. I really appreciated all your work.
A million thanks, everyone. Wonderful.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Good to hear from all of you.
Yeah. The worst thing about Zoom is that I press the end button and it is the end. So we don't sort of get a chance to say goodbye as we leave the room. So I hate pressing this button, but I'm going to do it now.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
What a really